So thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you on the other side of the screen for your interest. I, of course, would love to hold the whole thing in a room with all of you together, so we maybe can try also some of the products I'm going to mention later. But for now, that's the way it is, and I hope it's going to change very soon. Yeah, so parts of my presentation is based on my book titled The Flavor of Wood, or Der Geschmack von Holz. And part of it is also based on my continuous work in the area of food, forest, and trees, which is actually quite an interesting area to work in because, just let me see, I have to do it this way, because many people don't really see trees and forests in the context of food. They see it as a great way, you know, to play, to do your sports, as a perfect background for your social media photos, maybe. And then, of course, in its conventional way for the wood, which is used for building or also for fire. Fortunately, also due to the whole discussions around climate change in recent years, more and more people also are realizing the value for their ecosystem services. However, for me, now that I work in this sector for quite a while now, it's still quite interesting to see that people don't consider trees as food when they practically eat trees on a daily basis or quite often. So for example, if you had a green or black tea this morning, you had the leaves of the Camellia sinensis tree, for example. Or also if you're, especially in the Alpine regions, many of our traditional products in the area of cured meats or cheese are actually wood smoked, mostly with beech wood. So their very flavor is dependent on beech trees. Then we have, of course, the maple syrup, which is also now in Europe quite prevalent. We have cinnamon, which is the bark of a tree, and especially around Christmas, we get it in more and more products, it seems, every year. And then finally, also the food industry is using a lot of cellulose for example, in ready-made baked goods, where it's, on the one hand, it's great because it reduces the caloric value of the good, because we can't digest cellulose. And on the other hand, it almost works like a sponge, so it absorbs a lot of moisture and fat and keeps the product fresher for longer. So we eat, all of us are probably eating trees at least once a week or more often. Also, globally speaking, forests are very important. So the FAO estimate goes as far as to estimate that 25% of the global population, so that's 1.9 billion people at the moment, are directly dependent on forests for their livelihood. Everything from their income to their food to their medicine and also for shelter. And then also in times of crisis, be it a drought or a natural disaster or a war even, forests are quite often seen as the last refuge. So they're still hugely important for us. And they are also very important in the food industry as a whole. So as the previously mentioned maple syrup, for example, which is quite a big industry in North America. Then in the Baltic states, there is quite a big industry around birch water and birch syrup, which you can buy in the supermarkets now in springtime. Then in the tropics, of course, I already mentioned cinnamon, but there are also quite a few other tree-derived spices. In the Mediterranean, there is pine sap, which is, for example, in Greece used for red wine, but also mastic. And then, of course, gum arabic, which is quite a strong industry in some African countries and is used in so many ways in the food industry. Also in the Alpine regions, tree-derived foods are quite common. I mean, of course, all of you know the beautiful orchard meadows which we have, many of which, by the way, have non-native trees growing on them. They came just a bit earlier, but still they're non-native. Then, of course, we have the beautiful chestnut forests. There is a lot of walnut forest. And then also, particularly in the Alpine sector, there is, of course, I think famous or maybe infamous for some people, the pine cone schnapps. So all of those are quite important, also culturally speaking, are quite important in the Alpine sector. However, if you see it percentual, like as a percentual basis, globally, trees are a smaller part of the food system because much of the food system is actually based on just 4 plants, this being corn, soy, wheat, and rice. And together they make up the bulk of our food system, and actually most of the products you see in the supermarket, especially if you also include meat and milk products, because many animals are now fed with those grains, so they are also almost part of this. So globally, we are depending on 4 plants, which are grown in huge monocultures and then are all annual plants, which is probably not the best of ideas in times of climate change, rapid soil degradation, and extreme weather events. So we really have to change that. And we have to become much more diverse and resilient in the way we produce our food. And this is where trees actually come in, because they are going to form the very basis for a future food system. This is possible through systems like agroforestry. Many of you probably have heard of it before. It's just a combination of tree crops and agricultural crops. And it's done now. Now it's mostly, there are large-scale plantations in South America, but it's also more and more coming to Europe. There can be now mechanized, which means they can be scaled, which was a problem before. And they're overall, they're much more diverse, much more resilient, and also offer quite a lot of different revenue streams to farmers. So it's not just one crop, and if it fails, then everything is gone. Whereas here you have fruits, you have grains, you have wood after several years, and maybe you can also include leaves or tree saps. And so it's a much more diverse, also economically speaking, not just ecologically speaking. Of course, agroforestry has been practiced in Europe since thousands of years. The previously mentioned orchard meadows is one example. It's one kind of agroforestry. And then also, of course, all the hedgerows throughout Europe is another similar approach. A subset of agroforestry is silvopasture, so where you combine grazing animals with trees, which has many advantages. Again, the system is much more diverse. The trees growing in there, for example, in Alpine Region, stabilize the soil. And you get also more production out of it, because if you, for example, grow nut trees there, they produce and the animals produce. So again, it's interesting from an ecological point and from an economical point. Then one thing that has become quite the focus of the public interest, in my opinion, in a positive way in the recent years, is wild foods. So foods which are gathered from the natural world. And they are surprisingly make still up quite a large percentage of the global food supply. So it's not a niche thing at all. But they are here in our regions, they're still quite popular. And it's for many people, it's a great way to connect with the natural world, learn more about it. And also it's the basis for many new interesting food products coming out to market, also in restaurants, or what people cook at home. Altogether, it's not only those, if you want, older ways of producing food, which are now redefined in a new age or new millennia. It's also completely new technologies. So biotechnology now allows us, for example, to make human digestible protein directly from wood. What they're using now is wood waste from sawmills, and they are transforming it into human digestible protein. The first step was that they made fish food from it for aquaculture, but now we can eat it directly. And the most fascinating thing about it is across its whole lifespan, this kind of protein has half the carbon footprint of soy, which by itself already has quite a good carbon footprint. So we will definitely see much more wood on our plate in the future. So just wait for the next beechwood burger, probably. It's not that far away. Altogether, this way of seeing trees and forests from the food perspective, I think offers also an interesting view on the whole non-native tree discussion. Because not for me personally, I think it diversifies also our future food system to have as many different kinds of trees in it. Not only again from an ecological point of view, but also from an gastronomic or flavor kind of view, because trees tend to taste very differently. For example, I personally make quite a lot of dishes using different kind of conifer needles, and I know that they taste very different. So I have here the Douglas fir, which has, they all have quite citrusy, resinous aromas, the leaves, but the Douglas fir is more in the grapefruit direction, quite dark and strong, versus the white pine, which is one of my favorite. It has a very light, citrusy, almost sweet aroma. It makes for a really great tea. Then I have the black walnut, which by itself has quite a big industry in the North America, the nuts itself, so not the wood. And it's one of my favorite nut trees. And finally, also the cherry plum, which has invasive tendencies, but in Georgia, Armenia, and Turkey, it's absolutely considered an absolute delicacy. In Georgia, Armenia, they make kind of a ketchup from it, which you find in many restaurants, and it has a really great flavor. And in Turkey, they pickle the green fruits or also eat them as they are. So it's quite common actually. Then this whole food approach also offers an interesting way to maybe deal or approach invasive plants under the motto eat the weeds. By this, you could, for example, overuse, like purposefully overuse certain kinds of trees which are invasive, and thereby maybe not completely control them, but at least slow their distribution or map them at least, so you have a better understanding. And then they can be used for food products, which not just for personal use for people, but could actually be the basis for regional economies. So for example, I have just a few examples here. The sumac, its flowers make for a really great lemonade. The black cherry makes for really great pie fillings. Then the box elder, you can use it the same way you would use sugar maple for producing maple syrup. It just has a little bit of a lower sugar content. And finally, also the black locust, you can buy its flowers on markets all across Italy, also in Japan, where they dip it in batter and then fry it, and it tastes really good. And then also its wood is again really great to make barrels from. So some of the best white wines I've tasted ever were actually aged in black locust barrels. So there are many ways that it's not just on an individual basis interesting and maybe an interesting experiment and flavor, but that could be also very much the basis for rural economies, small scale, of course, but still. And this way you could also deal with invasive species. Next, it's not all about food, I think, especially with invasive species, but also with others. It's also, they are and could be much more so the basis for the bio-based industry. As we now try to get away as fast as possible from a fossil fuel-based industry and base everything from chemicals to fibers to materials to energy to everything on renewable resources. Trees, I think, they are really important in this aspect. Again, I have here the black locust, which there are now several peer-reviewed papers which say that it has antiviral properties, the extract from its leaves. It also has anti-cancer abilities, and most fascinatingly of all, or for me, it was very interesting, you can use the leaf extract to protect metals against corrosion. So it's a kind of a green corrosion protection for metals. Another thing is the ginkgo, which is grown in fields in northern Austria. They're also harvested even with machinery and sold to pharmaceutical companies, which make Alzheimer medicine from it. The poplar seeds are amazing. It's one of the best insulation material known to man, and there are now companies making duvet with poplar seeds. And finally, also the tree of heaven, which has quite a few invasive tendencies, is in China. It's the basis for quite a strong silk industry. And there's really no reason why it can't be also in Europe or in the Alpine regions a basis for some kind of a silk industry. So again, I think they are not only interesting in a food approach for rural development, but also as a basis for our whole industry of the future. Altogether, the whole approach to trees, forests, from the food perspective, in my personal experience, offers many interesting ways to communicate their importance and other things you want to communicate to people, because it's a very powerful communications tool. Whereas if you show them beautiful pictures or documentaries or give them something to read, there's always this distance between the people and the content. Whereas if you give them something to try, for example, I quite often make a pesto from black pine and from the needles, and people try it, they like it, and for that, many have already told me they will never see the pine in the same way because it's a very different approach. So it's a very valuable tool which can be used, for example, also in capacity building with environmental protection projects and in many other ways. And of course, if you have these regional economies based on some maybe strange tree or so food product, it's of course a match made in heaven for a tourism industry, which is always looking for, this kind of experience-based tourism where you have different which no one else has. So it's another interesting revenue stream for rural economies. Yeah, so this was just a quick look basically into the world of eating trees. I hope it was interesting for you. And yeah, I'm very open for any questions, suggestions, or anything. And yeah, thank you very much.
This was amazing. Thank you very much for this colorful presentation. And also it leads us into a weekend with a lot of new thoughts about what should I cook? How can I use non-native tree species, native tree species? So thank you very much. And I'm sure there are several questions. One question arrived here via a direct message to me. What about the toxicity? What about the toxic tree species? How do I learn if the tree species is eatable or not?
So there are a lot of resources actually online, and there are also many great books about it. In general, I think it's safe to say that there are much more trees are edible than we think. And it's always, it's the same rules as you have with mushroom gathering or so. You have to be 100% certain before you take it. That's for sure. But overall, in Europe, there are most trees you basically can eat. But still, I would, maybe most tree guides actually have some say, okay, it's poisonous, then it's also not safe to eat. So they most of them include it.